a great honor to see so interesting, so important conference. Online conferences have a lot of problems, and I respect our attempts to continue to hold, to support, to enhance our communication in today very serious and hectic times. Colleagues, I have to leave you, and my greetings all participants of this conference, and I hope everything will be good and excellent. Thank you very much indeed.
Andrei, many thanks for your introductory words. My name is Ettore Greco. I am the Executive Vice President of International Affairs Institute. I wish very much thank Valdai and Andrei and the other staff of Valdai for helping us to organize this meeting. It's a great pleasure to be able today to discuss a very topical issues, and one, I would say, which has been addressed rather extensively and deeply in the framework of G20. As you have seen, the title of the seminar is the G20 role towards a more internationally recognized ESG framework. This is, of course, a very ambitious goal, but is a goal that has been already discussed in a number of G20 meetings during the entire G20 process, from a very different perspective, with the idea of arriving at the G20 summit with part of the final statement specifically devoted to this very crucial aspect. As you know, I think it's not necessary to stress this point, but concern related to environment, social issues, and governance have been growing steadily and considerably in the last several years. And the very concept of ESG investment has become increasingly popular. We have witnessed a proliferation of studies, analysis, but also policy initiatives undertaken by both governments, but also private companies, which aim at exploring and identifying the most appropriate ways and means to promote the so-called sustainable investing. The fundamental principle there is now attracting, I think, increasingly interest and consideration worldwide, is that investment opportunity should be evaluated on the basis not only of the economic risks and opportunities that the investment may present, in other words, not only on their profitability, but also taking into account their impact on the environment and social development, which means it is not an easy task, an effort to include non-financial consideration, elements of different from strictly financial parameters in the assessment of, for instance, stock value of a company values, and also its investment strategies and concrete investment decision. In the field of environment, in particular, the focus is, of course, on issues such as the use of renewable energy resources, or waste management, or the level of pollution that industrial activities may cause. The governance dimension, so the second dimension, has much to do with the need for greater transparency on the part of the individual companies or group of companies, and a more comprehensive financial reporting, but also, for instance, the vexed questions of executive space or bonuses. The social dimension relates to the relationship a company has with its employees, but also more specifically policies conducted by the company at workplaces, including, for instance, the respect of privacy. We know how this problem of privacy is important in an increasingly digital economy. So the effects of digitalization, how the company cope with this effect are, of course, of increasingly great interest and attention worldwide. This growing demand for ESG investment, so ESG focused investment, call therefore for new business model, more environment friendly models on the part of the company. And the key question, which is not an easy one, not at all, is to what extent it's possible to introduce a new form of regulation, of standardization, especially for instance, publicly traded companies or even, for instance, pension funds. What role national regulators can play, what role international organizations or forums like the G20 can help promote this new model. Of course, a special role, special task have to be accomplished, in particular by financial services industries, and the debate is on, especially on mechanisms that induce financial companies, can induce financial companies to reward, in a sense, the more responsible companies and to give priority more concretely to investment aimed at favoring the energy transition. But of course, there are at least three big problems that we cannot ignore, according to many in the business world, not only in the business world. There is the need to continue to focus essentially or only on company financial value and profitability, because we know that in any case, responsible corporate behavior entails costs that can erode corporate or shareholder profits. At least this problem is perceived widely in the business world. A second problem is the parameters or criteria that can be established, how to establish, identify objective criteria of a company performance, which could become possibly even part or a key component of its credit rating. And third problem, which is indeed, we think should be at the center of our discussion today, are the marked differences between countries. Developed countries, we know, still rely heavily on traditional resources of energy. They have different capabilities compared with more developed countries. And we cannot pretend to aim at a full harmonization of this type of transformation and development. And as we have written in our concept for this meeting, we need to avoid a new dividing line and find a way, of course, this is at the very center of our discussion today, how to address the cost of energy transition. In this framework, the G20 has certainly a key role to play. I think the G20 has demonstrated to be able to identify and promote criteria and parameters, if not rules, to regulate several sectors. And this can be applied also to ESG field. This parameters or setting function of the G20 is often underestimated. And the issue is how to promote new business model, new types of investment, but also the G20 has discussed how fiscal policies can be brought more in line with the growing social and environmental concern. All those issues have been at the center of the climate and energy ministerial meeting in Naples. And the problem is, of course, more broadly, how to measure and control, in a sense, the performance of companies. There is now a high expectation that the results of this work done at the level of the G20 can be endorse possibly or even further develop at the G20 summit in October, and of course not less important at the COP26 in Glasgow, which will no doubt be a crucial event for the future of global climate policies. I think we also want to discuss in this sense the actual prospects of this process and what can be concretely come out from these crucial events. We will do that, let me stress this point, with the help of very qualified panel of experts with a mix of independent experts, government representatives, and also company executives. So I wish to thank all our panelists for accepting our invitation, and of course all of you for being with us today. I'm sure the meeting will offer many insightful inputs and suggestions. And so very much look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Bystrzycki and Mr. Greco, for your introduction. And my name is Yaroslav Lisavolek. I'm the program director with the Valdai Discussion Club. It is my pleasure to moderate this session. And at the outset, I think it should be noted that the ESG and the green agenda have taken on particular prominence in the world economy starting from this year. We see significant changes in terms of activism on this front, pretty much from all of the centers of the world economy, be it Europe, and Europe has already been quite active for quite some time in advancing this agenda, but also this year we're seeing in terms of the participation from advanced economies, the US is becoming far more involved and active in these issues. And then of course, it should be also stated that the developing countries and the largest developing economies are becoming more involved and more active in this domain. And China has clearly stepped up its efforts to become part of this process, and Russia as well. Russia has actively pursued the environmental agenda in the course of this year, both at the national level and at the corporate level. And I think we'll hear from some of the participants in the panel about the corporate experience of advancing ESG goals in Russia. And at this stage, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel. Dmitry Pristanskov, State Secretary and Vice President and Head of GR at Norilsk-Nickel. Mariano Machando, Counselor Member of Argentine Council for International Relations. Akshay Mathur, Director of ORF Mumbai and Head of Geoeconomic Studies Program. Claude Lopez, Head of Research Department at Milken Institute. Anton Sveertov, Deputy Director, Department of Multilateral Economic Cooperation and Special Projects at the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, and Agostino Inguscio, Senior Expert in the G7 G20 Sherpa Office of Italy Presidency of Council of Ministers. So let me at this stage now pass the floor to our distinguished speakers. And the first to take the floor is Dmitry Pristanskov from Norilsk-Nickel. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm glad to welcome you to the Valdai Online Roundtable, and thank you. Special thanks to Mr. Bystrzycki for the invitation to speak at this roundtable. At Norilsk-Nickel, we pay great attention to studying the best international ESG practice, and we try to use it in our investment decisions when applicable. And this year, I'm honored to represent the Russian participants of B20's Financial and Infrastructure Task Force within J20 Italian Presidency. In my comments, I would like to focus on the development and application of ESG standards and potential risks and consequences associated with efforts to implement them. So at the task force, we prepared a number of recommendations for the international community, which we called a non-paper on development of ESG standards in financial and infrastructure sectors. And the main purpose for our Italian colleagues of this document is to strengthen the foundations of international cooperation in the field of ESG and make it more adaptable to the needs and national conditions of various actors. And so I will share in brief the key points of these recommendations with respect to introducing and implementing ESG standards and practices. So since the beginning of the pandemic, all countries have experienced a dramatic disruption and drastic changes in the economic, social, and public spheres. The current challenges induce businesses to specify their strategies focusing on the sustainable development goals and the growing importance of the ESG factors as drivers of making progress in this area. Practical implementation of ESG is frequently hampered by activities of different international and national bodies, introducing their own interpretation of ESG. An important aspect is that small and medium businesses do not possess relevant capacity or experience to implement ESG, unlike large companies, for example, like Norilsk Nickel. Typical ESG tasks as writing ESG or sustainability reports require investing a certain amount of energy and resources, while the question of comparable return for small and medium enterprises from this time-consuming tasks remains open. A large business could facilitate capacity building and sharing expertise with small business on responsible business conduct. So the international business community should support the initiatives for elaborating a consistent approach to ESG implementation and reporting across the globe that will contribute to setting general evaluation and assessment criteria, decreasing compliance expenses, stimulating the sustainable development goals achievement efforts. However, there are several obstacles which may hinder such initiatives that should be taken into account. And among them are the following. For example, different countries have different levels of economic development and legal and regulatory frameworks that do not allow a one-size-fits-all approach. Measuring ESG performances is difficult because of the lack of consistent approaches to collecting necessary data and information. Bond issuers have concerns about possible claims from investors concerning non-financial information. Different countries have different approaches to the classification of certain sectors as green, for example. Nuclear energy in some countries is seen as non-green, while in others is green. So in the current situation, it's difficult to deny the need to develop a consistent approach to the ESG. Ensuring ESG factors adoption in business practice for sustainable development goals implementation should be comprehensive and adaptive because it's crucial for the achievement of the SDGs. It's reasonable to elaborate recommendations for companies on the effects of ESG factors introduction in the strategy and practice of businesses for their sustainable development goals implementations and companies. It should be of particular importance for small and medium enterprises. The dialogue on standardization of ESG standards should be as inclusive as possible and include state representatives and professional business experts and academic communities. Under no circumstances, ESG performance and standards should be used for political purposes and serve as a disguised means of political struggle. Also, ESG standards, in any case, should take into account countries' circumstances, level of economic development, and to be sector specific. So it's necessary to continue the alignment of ESG criteria and practices with the work on transforming infrastructure into an asset class, including by promoting the introduction of the ESG criteria and practices under the implementation of infrastructure projects that may have a favorable impact on finance modeling, insurance, guarantees. And we advised to add the above mentioned approaches to the summary of G20 final recommendations to global leaders. I think that's all, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Pristanskov. I think it's very useful for us to hear the perspective from the B20 side, and I think in further discussing this in the framework of T20, I think some of your arguments regarding the need for a consistent approach, I'm sure will be taken up by a lot of our other speakers. So at this stage, I'd like to pass on the floor to Mariano Machando and to hear your perspectives on what has been discussed and perhaps some of the other themes within our today's topic.
Thank you. And thank you to both institutions for the invitation. And thank you all panelists for sharing this discussion. I think the timing for this discussion is utmost pertinent, specifically not only because of Italy's great exercise of leadership during the presidency of the G20, but also in the run-up to COP26. I think these are not starting points by any means, because this has been an ongoing discussion as we have heard before. But it seems like we need to become more much more creative and speed up the pace in terms of these discussions for a number of reasons that I want to share with you today. And on that regard, I think the setting of what we're talking about has already been carefully laid out for us. We're talking about a wave of investment related to sustainability across a number of areas and indicators. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that despite evident conversions between the SDG, I'm talking about the 2030 agenda, sovereignly defined by states many years ago, and the criteria we're talking about, the ESG standards, which as of now estimations put around close to 185 initiatives and close to 60 classifications named as standards. Despite the evident conversions in terms of the drives behind these two sets of criteria and agendas, what we are not seeing is a bridge to build and to mutually reinforce the capacity of these two forces. This is the capacity of sovereign states to basically abide by their commitments in the 2030 agenda, and at the same time efficiently boost a match of funding estimated as of now, the gap in funding to reach the goals, the 17 goals of the 2030 agenda, around $25 trillion throughout the next decade. We are seeing this gap between these two worlds. And the question is, if we need to do something about that, that is the first question. The second is, if we decide we need to do something about that, what are the options out there? And having the challenge at hand, our proposal, this was codified through a policy brief that we submitted, and T20 was kindly enough to accept and to and that explains our presence here in this discussion, is that first, the trend is well underway. We're talking about something that will happen regardless of what we think about it. That's important always to recognize. Second, time is of the essence. Perhaps that's something that you can apply to any period in history, but particularly now, these types of discussions are incredibly pertinent, but specifically because incentives for further dispersion of criteria, the things we've been talking about, the proliferation of standards, are much more aligned and much more present than the opposite forces. The idea of trying to get to common ground and develop, if you want to, a lingua franca in terms of something that everyone could use on equal footing. Third to that, and why the G20, as before, can act to promote changes in regard to fostering standardization for private public cooperation. Unlike any other fora, and apologies if I'm rushing up, but I want to abide by the 5-minute rule, the G20 is furnished with a degree of legitimacy that perhaps it's not easy to find in many other international organizations and international settings in which the leaders of the world sit down to discuss, both in terms of GDP, in terms of representation of the population, also in terms of precedent. The G20 has discussed similar approaches before and has been able to deliver some of the tools that we already have in the toolbox, especially after a crisis like the one we are getting out of, quote unquote, because part of the world still has not come out of COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts. But then again, this toolbox is open, but will require something new. And there's many pitfalls to fall in there when it comes to ESG standardization, because the first one could be the idea of, and I think that the colleague that preceded me in the use of the mic mentioned this, there is this temptation perhaps to go for a one-size-fits-all type of approach. There might be a temptation also to make this a well-intended effort, but a non-binding one. So we have seen these pitfalls before as well. And there might be the temptation to comply with this, sorry for the non-formal term, hype around the issue, and just leave here this as a one-off effort and just move on, or perhaps continue business as usual. And the proposal we tabled, this is very initial on the drafts, lots of things to consider, lots of efforts to converge here, is to perhaps think about a meta framework for ESG standards and not necessarily yet another framework. So what's the difference between one or the other? The difference is that if we call it the ESG 20, just to make it more marketable, the idea is to provide something that allows for flexible adopting procedures, but also comprehensive adapting processes at the sovereign level. And what does this mean? It means that, as with other instruments that the G20 has proposed and tabled before, there, in the case of the adopting procedure, you have a national focal point. You need to assess the framework's effectiveness. You need to undertake promotional activity, handle inquiries. You need to work on this at the national level, but in coherence with a central point. The second, the adopting part, is that, let's sum it up in respecting each jurisdiction situation regarding to this. Being an Argentinian national, I do know the size and weight of my financial market in the country vis-a-vis other financial markets in the world. And the speed at which I need to implement this might be faster, actually, because our market size is smaller, and the opposite way around. So we need to mind these factors to avoid the pitfalls I mentioned before. This is a one-off temptation, a one-size-fits-all temptation, and well-intended but non-binding. And we do believe, and we have vouched for this in our paper, that the G20 can lead the charge in such innovation. There are a number of initiatives, as it was mentioned before, going on, but at the same time, and perhaps this is a matter to discuss in the Q&A session, it does feel we might be sleepwalking into a resolution of the situation instead of actively trying to think what's best to seize what, so far, this is not entirely true, but let me sum it up for the sake of the conversation. It seems like an organic solution that the system has delivered. And by organic, I mean the trend in relation to the interest, the growing interest on ESG criteria as guiding principles for investment has predominantly come from the private sector, and organically seems to be matching the priorities that the public sector codified lots of years ago. So circling back to the beginning of my words. So the best way to tackle an opportunity that seems to be coming at perhaps too late, but at least not later than today, in terms of being able to match the needs in both camps and to provide a tool that it could be and can be used on equal footing for both states, private sector companies, and other actors seeking to invest in all of this. I think it's worth our conversation, it's worth our time. And I'd be more than glad to take any questions during the Q&A session to continue this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these very insightful comments. I particularly enjoyed the proposal on ESG 20 as a flexible framework to take into account some of the divergence that is out there. And I think you're absolutely right that the G20 is probably best positioned to take on the lead in trying to bring together all of these various standards and systems governing ESG related issues. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of your proposals and insights later on in the Q&A session. But at this stage, let me now proceed to give the floor to Akshay Mathur from the ORF Mumbai Foundation. Please, Akshay.
Thank you very much for having me. I want to just maybe break my points down into three parts because clearly ESG is very important and a lot has been written about it and a lot has been said about it already. I think for us, what I'm noticing is that the first institution that really needs to take charge of ESG and ESG principles are the multilateral institutions themselves, whether it is the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank, perhaps even some of the ESG related expectations that we have from trade. I think the institutions need to take the leadership, at least if not defining standards for the world, but in their own practice to start defining what it means. So, for instance, after the multilateral development banks have been talking about developing infrastructure as an asset class. At the G20, there's a sustainable finance working group, which came from the green finance study group. All of these institutions have been thinking about ESG. But a good starting point would be the multilateral institutions. And the G20 Eminent Persons Group report also made some good suggestions on how the multilateral development banks can be reconfigured to focus on ESG. So I think the first place would be to start there. The second place I would say is to look at international financial regulations. Now, the disclosure and the non-financial reporting has been mentioned by some of the speakers here. There is now a very well-known trend on the work that has already happened on disclosures. There's a lot of work that has happened from voluntary initiatives. Also work that the United Nations has done with principles for responsible investing, shaping some of these standards. And then, of course, G20 and Financial Stability Board led climate disclosure standards, which have come in more lately, which are more focused towards climate. All of these disclosure standards, there's efforts being made on how to reconcile them. There's the Standards and Accountability Stability Board, which I think is in the United States, but there's also talk about the International Sustainability Standards Boards, which is coming up to define a global accounting standard for sustainability reporting. So there's a lot going on in the disclosures. And without harmonization, as some of the other speakers have alluded, it's going to be very difficult in ascertaining what truly is ESG. I think when we talk about ESG, and I can come back to it later if there's a question, but in India, to give us specific examples, actually, there has been a voluntary guidelines that the government Ministry of Corporate Affairs have come up 3 to 4 years ago, which really set the standards for what ESG means. And then it was adopted specifically by the Securities and Exchange Board, which is the securities regulator, more specifically to first apply to the top 100 listed companies on the exchanges. Then gradually it was made mandatory for 500. And this year they've made it mandatory disclosure for the top 1,000 companies that are listed on the exchanges to disclose sustainability reporting. Now, it's interesting to note that I think the technical term that India is using is business and sustainability reporting. But now with climate-related disclosures also gathering steam, the sustainability reporting has to be refined in India to adopt what is coming down from the G20 and FSB, specifically the TCFD standards. So there is some pullback and some room being made so that the sustainability reporting can be more focused on climate. And of course, there is an issue because, you know, the ESG reporting covers everything. So it goes everything from anti-corruption to education. And again, climate-related standards seem to be more specific and more digestible, whereas the sustainability reporting is much more wider. And lastly, on the third point, I want to come to institutional investors. I think here we're seeing globally that the institutional investors are still not aligned to global sustainability reporting as much as we would like them to be. And we are seeing this in two ways. One is that just in terms of the number of institutional investors that are now reporting, even TCFD or some of the United Nations related disclosure standards, there are very few of them. And some of them are not only not aligned, but they're misaligned to the Paris agreements. And the second one is that there is growing importance and growing focus on shareholder voting on climate-related resolutions that are taking place. And this is very important for us to follow, whether in the institutional investors, by the way, institutional investors now account for over $100 trillion in assets under management. In fact, the top 5 institutional investors, which is your Vanguard, BlackRock, Fidelity, etc., each of them, the top 5 have trillions in assets under management. And so I think that we need to examine their positions on climate-related resolutions that are coming up for voting. And that's, I think, going to be critical, because unless the institutional investors decide themselves on what they want to do on ESG, and 2, unless they can vote appropriately on climate-related resolutions that are coming up during the board meetings, in the annual meetings that take place, it's going to be a very tough battle. And so what I will do is I'll stop here. What I wanted to do was break it up into 3 parts: the role of the multilateral institutions, the disclosure standards, and the institutional investors. Happy to come back to answer specific questions if there are any. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is, I think, indeed very insightful and useful for our discussion. I think the dimension that you bring with the institutional investors, I think, is very important, because if there is indeed a critical mass amongst the institutional investors that follow and support the ESG principles, this is a qualitative, very important trend that is set then for the financial markets more broadly. And I think the corporates that are pretty much the recipients of these funds from the institutional investors, they would have far more interest, so to say, in pursuing the ESG principles if there is more ESG following within the institutional investor community. So let me now pass the floor on to Claude Lopez from the Milken Institute. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So this is already a very interesting discussion, and I'm not sure where I can add, except that we all agree talking about ESG, but most of the discussion, or a lot of the discussion that we already had, shows that we automatically link the notion of ESG to sustainability. And if you really look at fundamentally what ESG is about risk management, okay, which are non-financial risk. And really, because at the beginning of everything, this concept of ESG is for the firm and for investors. So we have an understanding of the other type, the resilience of a company, whether or not you want to invest in it. And we understood that, well, beyond financial risk, there is a lot of other risks that are maybe not short-term, but a little bit longer or medium or longer. And this framework of ESG is supposed to be able to capture that initially. Of course, we saw also that it's such an appealing concept and so trendy nowadays that it tends to be used as a really nice marketing tool to link that to other issues that we have at the societal level, such as having a more inclusive, fairer type of society. And so all that is linked together, while it's not clear that automatically the concept of ESG at the firm level should not naturally lead to the sustainable development goals from the UN, while often it's quite linked. And so in the proposition that we submitted to the T20 with Jose Sadia Serrate is very much to focus on defining what are we talking about. And if we are clear about what we're talking about, even before just the standardization and identifying the variables that we're going to be using to really try to monitor this non-financial part of a performance of a company, is we need to know what we talk about. So, and ESG, environment, social and governance are so different concepts that also there is this issue of bias with aggregation. If you add apple with orange with a lemon, it's not clear that the score that you're going to end up having is actually provide you, the investor, with anything that you really truly understand whenever you want your investment to matter. And so whenever we talk about what are we talking about, which is what are we trying to achieve? Because that will also help a company to know what type of change they should make to be either be rewarded or not. Because depending on the type of investment that you have, you can sanction or support. So what are we talking about is very much for the implementation also is very much about risk assessment and risk resilience. And that really is the concept of having standardization, that means what type of variable allow you and as a firm and allows the different investors and whoever will be in charge of monitoring your performance to really assess whether or not you're on the right track. As of now, most of the time, companies are being rewarded mostly because they are making an effort in the right direction. So what are we talking about means that we're going to identify the direction. Once we know what we try to achieve on the E, S, or G dimension, and I agree, one size cannot fit all because it's very much not company specific, but industry specific, sector specific. Where are you geographically speaking? Because there is no way ESG framework can be sustainable if it's not also helping growth in a country. Okay, it cannot be. It has to be part of a solution for a broader social aspect. So what are we talking about? Once we know the direction, then of course we need to create some benchmark. What are we trying to achieve? And that will naturally bring accountability. Depending on what we're trying to achieve, we can have goals. We suggest in our policy brief to have 10-year goals regarding the direction. Do you want to be more inclusive? Do you want to have more diversity? Do you want to try to have some impact? We talked about climate change. We talk about environmental. We all know that it's not in 10 years that you make changes that will automatically being able to be seen in the environment. However, there is steps, so slicing things regarding step that you're trying to achieve and use those benchmarks to assess the performance of a firm will bring few things. First of all, that means that there is a clear agreement regarding standardized information that need to be shared to do this assessment so you can compare across companies. That will bring accountability for the firm, but also reward. That means you know that if you make an effort, you will understand better how you're going to be assessed. And for investors, of course, that allows them to have investment in line with their values, whatever those values are. And for government or country also, then the benchmarking could be something that can be used if you really want to trigger some type of change, which is from the resilience of a company to really having an impact at the societal level, at the environmental level, but this link between sustainability, UN style, and ESG is not clear. And actually, I don't even think it's actually implied. It's a decision that has to be made. And of course, whenever we talk about assessment, because we know that the ESG framework is more and more complex, and that means many investors are relying on third party to assess really each firm. They need also to be transparency regarding the information, standardized information that is being shared, how it's been processed, because as we said, the big issue of ESG is non-financial. So that means quantifying really what's happening is going to be challenging. And it's okay to have different way of assessing depending on the priority you put in your own rating. And so overall, while it's really important to have right now really a good push regarding ESG, we first need to clarify what are we talking about, then to have specific idea of what are the goals. Once you know the goals, then you can slice it, and to have some type of step that you need to move forward that will bring accountability and allow, whenever we talk about how well those well-performing ESG firms are doing also financially, we actually know that we're talking about the same thing, and transparency in the assessment. And if we do that, and if we also are realistic regarding what can be done and where we're going, then automatically this framework could become truly a source of change. But for that, you need to bring accountability in the process. Otherwise, it's just fancy words. I'm going to stop here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. And I think accountability is probably the key word in terms of trying to avoid some of the phenomena that we already see with ESG, such as greenwashing, for example. And clearly, the more transparency, the more accountability, the less scope for that kind of practice to be undertaken at the corporate level. And I think your point also about the need to ensure greater consistency and greater connectivity between ESG goals and the SDG goals, the United Nations goals, is also very important. And that would be a very important connection between the micro level of corporates and the macro level of countries and the international system. So at this stage, I think we are well in the position now to hear from the decision makers, from the representatives of government bodies. And I would like now to pass on the floor to Anton Sveertov, Deputy Director of the Department of Multilateral Economic Cooperation with the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation.
Thank you so much, Yaroslav, and thank you for the IAI and the Valdai Club for holding this discussion. There are a lot of discussions on ESG issues these days, but it's really good to feel that there is that we are going beyond the sort of the simple things, right? Where we have all agreed that this is something important. We've all agreed that this is something we have to work on, and to actually get into the complicated stuff, especially on how this is something I think we could pick up on a little bit more, especially on how the corporate sector, the private sector, and the sustainability trend that exists there connects with what we are trying to do as governments, because that is it's not as apparent and as easy as it sometimes seems. So I also thank the Italian presidency for being so adamant in raising issues of sustainability across the agenda of G20 this year. I think there is a sustainability angle to almost every track in the presidency's agendas this year. Me personally, I'm most involved in the climate sustainability and the energy transition track, but also helping out on issues in the sustainable finance working group and the development working group. So there are a lot of issues that are being discussed there. Some of them overlap, some of them mutually reinforce each other. But I think that what we are seeing right now is that despite this unanimous understanding of the importance of sustainability, there are a lot of discussions going on between countries, between G20 members on both the precise goals we are setting for the global community and maybe even more so on the instruments, how we do that, and what are the best ways to achieve even those goals that we agree on. So, I think this is very important for the G20 to continue raising these issues and discussing them, because I think it has been mentioned today, I think by one of the speakers, that the G20 still remains the key platform for it's a representative platform, and it's a key platform for members to bridge the differences they still may have in how we might achieve the goals we set. I won't be talking too much about what Russia is doing in this sense, because it's not a self-presentation, but we are deeply involved in these discussions internationally and domestically. We've just had our national green finance, sustainable finance taxonomy out, and it's an important step for us. So we're also holding discussions internationally to see how that links to the existing taxonomies elsewhere. There's of course a lot going on in terms of domestic regulation, but I think, again, this is an important point. We are driven significantly by the private sector, and the Russian private sector is very much advanced in this issue, especially for large global companies. I mean, this has been a trend for years now. We don't need to explain to them why this is something that has to be taken care of. What we hear, and this is something that has been raised by many speakers today, is that there's this plethora of standards, and you have accounting standards, you have accountability standards, you have reporting standards, you have finance taxonomies, and I think what actually I mentioned that what Mariano did with Mariano, I think that we don't need yet another framework, right? We have, but then again, I don't know whether it's a straightforward thing to do the framework, right? So it's a complicated game between having something that is applicable for particular needs of the private sector, but it's also having and using the G20's potential and the G20's special position and responsibility of the countries to show some direction, right? And to perhaps address this very important issue of linking the ESG frameworks, various ESG frameworks, and the Sustainable Development Goals framework. And perhaps that could be something that the G20 members could discuss and see where they can go forward from there. Because as actually I mentioned, the institutional investors are there, the multilateral development banks are moving in that direction. So I think for us as governments, it's important to, well, in a sense, the private sector recognizes that better than we do, that there are concrete financial implications for doing the ESG thing or not doing it. And I think Claude mentioned this as well, that it's a matter of risk. There's, for example, the OECD framework for responsible business conduct, and it also focuses significantly on risks, and it specifies that's not financial risk. But I mean, I think it's good at some point it does become financial risk, and in any way it is quantifiable, because it does reflect in concrete operational or financial costs or additional revenue and opportunity. So this is something that I think is important as well. We have to continue to present this as opportunity, and it's those all these institutional investors that actually I mentioned, and we're talking about additional sources of finance and sustainable finance, and those are new markets for new goods and new industries that exist in sustainability-linked sectors. And we have a lot of experience in Russia as well in the private sector, when companies do attract finance on concessional conditions that is linked to their ability to achieve particular parameters and particular indicators in the sustainable development framework. And you have, for example, UNCTAD and the International Standards of Accounting and Reporting that also working on guidance on how the private sector can at least report on sustainable development goals. So, and I think Claude mentioned that the link is not apparent between the SDGs and Sustainable Development Agenda as something that was negotiated and adopted by governments, and the ESG trends going on in the private sector. But I think there are some things that could be pointed to, right? So first of all, if you look at the SDGs, they do translate into quite direct implications for the private sector in terms of new standards, in terms of new opportunities, and how that affects the supply and demand. In the very eventually, right? There are principles in the Sustainable Development Agenda that can point towards how a framework might look like. You have the leaving no one behind principle. You have the indivisibility of the Sustainable Development Agenda. So our aim is to work on achieving a sustainable development goal without negatively affecting the others, right? And that is a very simple rule of thumb that is very applicable, I think, and it's something that could be put into a framework. And again, just to wrap up my intervention, I think that for the G20 and for the remainder of the Italian presidency and for the future presidencies, I think it's not going away for the next several years. I think it's important to build this consensus between key economies of the world. And I think this is what the G20 is for. It's for consensus building, at least on the key directions where we would incentivize the private sector to go in terms of having these frameworks. So maybe it's not necessarily a superstructure over the various existing frameworks that there are in international organizations, in the private sector, or in for other stakeholders. But it's showing that there is consensus among major economies that this is where how our economies should be transforming, so that we can contribute also to societal development and also to environmental issues, of course, primarily combating climate change. So that would be my reaction, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sveertov, for these observations. And I think it's always good to have someone imbue the discussion with a dosage of realism with regard, in this case specifically, to the possibility of arriving at a framework, comprehensive framework in a short time span. Clearly, it's going to take some time, and complete universalism, as has been mentioned also by other speakers, is very problematic here. So let me now proceed to our final speaker, Agostino Inguscio. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Jaroslav, and thank you to the Istituto Affari Internazionali and to the Valdai discussion group, because really, I think these discussions are, to me, what a T20 discussion should be doing, right? So it's really important for myself, for Anton, for others, to be able to make sure, right, that we can have the appropriate knowledge base drive our efforts, and especially in this field, it's very complicated, of course. So just to build on Anton's set of presentation just now, I wanted to just say that Anton was the protagonist in Napoli of one of the most incredible diplomatic representations that I've ever seen, and he was engaged in this trilateral conversation with John Kerry and the head of energy for the European Union, and it was really remarkable, and he really did a great job. Regarding the themes, as Anton underlined, indeed, Italy, as presidency of G20, really focused on risking to replicate rather than risking to missing out on these very important themes. And these themes are quite prevalent, of course, in the finance track and in the Sherpa track. So on the finance track, as you already stressed, the most important aspect for us has been the reestablishment and the elevation of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group into a formal roadmap. It's going to be a multi-year roadmap, and of course, we're all waiting for its results. My role in the G20 is to coordinate the climate and energy dimension of the work of the Sherpa track. Therefore, now we are quite busy in finalizing the negotiations leading to the Leader Summit, which is going to take place at the end of the month. And for now, for us, we really see the G20 as crucial in this sort of like wider direction set, right? So our idea is a little bit like along the lines of what Jaroslav and others have touched upon, to essentially sort of channel what is clearly happening at the global level in the financial sector, and sort of like send a very strong message from the multilateral level, from the governments of the 20 largest economies, to send a strong message that essentially there is no going back. In the climate and energy ministerial and now at the leaders level, we are definitely trying to work a little bit into the direction of what Mariano and Claude referred to. So we are trying to really like sort of make the link between Agenda 2030 and the necessity to achieve ESG standards. So in our text, also the leaders level, of course, we see the necessity to invest in order to realign financial flows in a manner that is comparable with the Paris Agreement, also with the objective, naturally, of meeting SDGs. We know that this is not a given per se, and this is why it's a very important conversation to have. Regarding several of the other points that I've heard quite recurrently from Anton, Sveertov, Akshay Mathur, indeed, we want the G20 to be an open forum of conversation, and we are striving as much as possible to have a conversation which really recognizes the different national circumstances, but that is sort of like bounded essentially by a common destination, because basically the starting point in the discussions, thankfully this year, as Ettore Greco in the opening was saying, is that there is a very broad agreement now on the fact that the science is there to be followed, and that essentially there is no alternative between acting or not acting, right? Because essentially if we don't want to have a world economy that is 20% smaller in 30 years' time with an impossibility of achieving a lot of SDGs, we clearly need to act now. So given the fact that this starting point is clear, then the work that we're doing, it's indeed, at least in the Sherpa track, in the leaders track, I would second Anton's Sveertov words, which is more of a general direction work, while in the finance track and in the finance track roadmap, there is more of what others have referred to as a need for accountability and harmonization of different initiatives going on. So in that case, instead, there is more of a technical work, I would say, on how to bring together all these issues. Others have pointed out, of course, to the importance of COP26, starting the week after, the day after, in reality, the Leaders Summit in Rome. Indeed, this is crucial. And for instance, we watch very carefully the initiatives that are taking place for the private sector, also in COP26, such as the race to zero and the race to zero for financial institutions. And there again, we see reasons to hope, no? Because essentially we see that what are the targets or the aspirations that the G20 can set, in fact, then create a reinforcement of the movement of the private sector, which, as Jaroslav, you pointed out quite clearly in your opening remarks, it's already moving quite rapidly in the direction of ESG transition in a much more polyhedric form than just Europe or just the US or just the UK. So indeed, we are acting quite strongly on these themes because it's the broader G20 community that asks us to do so. I'm here to listen and to your inputs, and I look forward, of course, to read also your inputs in writing. And I hope that this can be a conversation that we carry on forwards also beyond G20, as we know that Italy will have the COP26 presidency together with the UK next year, but differently from the G20, right, where our presidency ends with the summit, the COP26 process starts with the meeting in Glasgow, and then we will have the presidency throughout the year. So this is a conversation that is not going away, of course, from the side of the Italian government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these remarks, and I do have to say that it's a pleasure to see how coherent the messages are from the Russian side and from the Italian side of the G20 framework. I think clearly there's the effort and the need that is seen to try to attain the SDGs, the UN SDGs, and to have the ESG principles, the environmental agenda, become more incorporated with the UN SDG agenda. So at this stage, I think we're done with all of the main interventions, and we can now proceed into the Q&A session. And I'm glad to say that we have a number of questions. One of the questions has been directed into our chat. And the question comes from Aruna Gohil. And I would say that it's addressed to Akshay Mathur and also to Claude Lopez. And the question is along the lines of the importance of accountability and transparency that the speakers noted. And probably it would be important to try to elucidate or to explain how this greater transparency and accountability could be attained at the corporate level. So Akshay or Claude, any one of you in terms of views with regard to this question?
I think as I mentioned, there is a need for transparency, and transparency is inherently, from a systematic perspective, when you ask corporates to be transparent, you have to provide a framework on what exactly you're asking them to be transparent about. And therefore, all of these discussions will necessarily reduce down to what are the parameters and what framework. So there is just no getting away from the requirement of having a common taxonomy, a common standard, common disclosure standards, reporting standards, common guidelines. I think there is just no way getting around it. Now, defining that common standard is hard work. It is hard enough to do it in a narrow spectrum, of financial reporting, even if you take debt disclosures, for instance. It's very hard to do. Doing it for climate is harder. Doing it for ESG is even harder because there are so many things there under the ESG bracket. So I think that transparency is, no one's denying that it is the most important thing. It's just how do you enforce it? What is it that you require and how do you enforce it? Now, of course, like in India and many other nations, we already have a framework. We started with some voluntary guidelines. The securities regulator picked it up and devised a set of parameters, and they have enforced it, say, for the top 500 or the top 1,000 companies. Is that enough? Probably not. I think we need to go one step deeper in identifying what is it that we want companies to do. One of the things, as I was talking about, was what are the steps that are being taken in companies, and especially not just imposing those disclosure standards on the companies, but also on the institutional investors that invest in the companies. So both ways we get a certain kind of certain transparency. And this is not my idea. I mean, this idea has been out in the public domain on how we can get more institutional investors to align, not just the firms. And therefore, please remember that the institutional investors are one step further away from the company. So if you have one auto company or a financial services company, you can impose some sort of disclosure standards. And then you have the investors, and asking the investors to disclose where their mutual funds are investing and what are those companies doing, where the mutual funds are investing in, is another level of complexity. This is all in the public domain. There are efforts being made to reconcile these standards. The United Nations, the G20, the Financial Stability Board, all of them have made certain effort. It is hard and it is currently being done. I think the reason I want to give an extra level of emphasis on institutional investors is because they have a certain amount of influence. The total balance sheet of all the multilateral development banks combined is maybe $1.5 to $2 trillion. The combined assets under management of institutional investors is $100 trillion. That's the magnitude that we are talking about. That's the kind of influence that we are talking about, right? So I think there a special amount of effort has to be put into institutional investors. That was the limited point I was trying to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will add actually to what you said. You talked about firm and you talk about investors, but in the middle, you also have those companies who actually are rating the different and that's where, whenever I was talking about transparency, I was also paying attention to them, because you can have a very standardized way of assessing and disclosure, and that's true. But one of the issues, and that's what we saw in some of the research that we did here at the Milken Institute, is that how you can, even if you have the variable and you have those different way of quantifying, is how you aggregate them. We also have an impact on the assessment. And it's absolutely fine to have different methodology when you do that. Being transparent about it will help the investor, institutional investors, to make sure that they end up investing with a firm that represent their values. And then I also would like to dissociate the notion of transparency with accountability. Accountability go one step further, which is where that means there is benchmarks that you need to meet. And we all, I think, agree that we need to have the buy-in of the private sector. We're not talking about sanctioning, we're talking about guiding in the right direction. Firms that also by themselves want to be resilient, okay? So we all look at the same target, except that if you're a firm, maybe your time horizon is also regarding surviving today and tomorrow and in 10 years and later. And so this notion of accountability, the benchmarking, that will also add an extra layer of information for the investor, but for the firm themselves too, because that will provide guidance regarding, depending on what you try to achieve. If you have standardized way of disclosing part of the information and how you perform relative to one specific benchmark that has been agreed upon, it will make the movement more effective. And the accountability also come from for the investor, but also the regulatory side, because at some point in the beginning of this discussion, it was said that ESG framework should not be politicized, and we see that it could be very easily taken as hostage to a lot of discussion right now. I think there was some discussion regarding the nuclear energy that, depending from which lens you look at, could be green or not green. So we also need to be really clear that we're talking about really improving an overall situation on Earth, that at the end of the story, if we do it properly, there should be reconciliation between the ESG risk management, and whenever you add up, it should go towards the SDG. I mean, but all those things will not happen naturally. They need to be guided, and that's where transparency and benchmarking accountability will absolutely lead to that direction. A firm would have the right incentive to do so.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think Mr. Mariano Machando also wanted to comment on this issue.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Asha and Claude, for your comments. I think we're actually, and one conversation is never enough for anything, but in particular for this issue. but I really believe we are shedding light on even more challenges that this issue entails. And by that, I mean, I carefully heard your expositions and the responses you just provided. And I was just trying to think how many toes we're stepping on in terms of the things we consider to be necessary for this discussion to come to fruition. Just by way of example, and I open my remarks with this very question. The first question, and I do have some adamant colleagues that says that nothing is to be done, that this is being organically solved by private forces, and we should just step aside and look at it and to take note of where the market is going. But again, assuming that's not the stance we're taking, and we do believe we need to do something, the first set of toes we'll be stepping on when we talk about transparency and accountability would be, I believe, when Claude, you were talking about goals, I'm hearing KPIs, and I'm hearing financial investors currently, this is not hypothetical, this is actually going on, engaging with governments, seeking to establish financial KPIs for their assets in their conversations as a way to nudge an incentive and turn risk management into what you were saying, Claude, and Ashko was also saying this, into something that goes away from risk management into enhancing and nudging this type of behaviors on behalf of governments driven by the private sector. When we hear accountability and transparency, I'm thinking, should we need to focus on the things that are supposed to be measured, as your paper with Jose talks about, or should we focus on the way the things are being measured? Because on the second camp, the only thing I can hear of is intellectual property. And a lot of companies saying, hey, the X thing that we are assessing is out there, but all of us have different ways of doing that. That's exactly our edge. That's exactly our drive. And some may argue that it's up to the private company X that decides to engage in contracting with data vendor Y to ask these questions, sign an NDA, and use their data instead of using other people's data. And what I'm not necessarily defending these positions. I'm saying this can go going on. But what I'm thinking is, as much as Claude says we need to define what we're talking about, I would amplify that question, not the answer, no answers here, the question into which portions are we able, and by we mean solely focus on what the G20 could produce as a global good in terms of a decision, a framework, something that fit this much more thick lines that on the sovereign side, you have those, on the private side, you have another set of very thick borders that you cannot trespass because of previous contracts and anything that I was just mentioning, and how to fill the space in the middle without going into these spaces that could actually, I think the first thing that comes to mind when I think about that is that knee-jerk reaction against any type of reform, any type of proposal, if it overstep in what it could be perceived as business, just to start with, this is my business, providing data is my business, all the way up to sovereign decisions, because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with if we're only simplifying this, private and public sector, we're dealing with previously crystallized enshrined decisions that in the end, all of these subjects are in a way meddling with. And that is a very sensitive area that we also need to take into consideration for this. That, of course, no surprise there, spoiler alert, goes back to the proposal we table in the policy brief about minding these. But then again, I think every stone we find in the way, we're going to turn it and we're going to bump into another question about how to deal with. Because we keep talking about the private sector and investment, but there's also the private sector that provides data, and there's also the private sector that it's a rule taker, and the public sector that provides data, and the public sector that becomes a rule taker. And India's market has the ability to develop a framework because of the size of the economy, but 50% of the rest of the countries don't have that capacity because their market size don't generate that demand, if you know what I mean. So we're seeing a lot of rules, a lot of frontiers that we need to also think how to engage rather than provide arguments to continue business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these observations. Our time is running out, unfortunately, but I did want to mention one question from the Russian Youth Diplomacy Journal, and the question is about how widely is the environmental and the ESG theme covered in the media of the countries that are represented by the speakers, whether it's Argentina, Italy. In Russia, I can tell you that clearly we've seen a tremendous change with a very substantial increase in the frequency of articles dedicated to this theme. So any very brief remarks, because we're really out of time, but very brief comments regarding this would be very welcome.
This is from Italy. Thank you. It's a good question, Yaroslav. I can share with you, and you can share with our listeners, a new report. It was quite important for our work as presidency of the Stockholm Resilience Center that did an overview survey of all the G20 countries, also media coverage. And the results are very impressive because climate and nature really are, for all countries, at the very top of the agenda. And what's incredibly interesting for me is that more so in countries like Russia, Brazil, China, others than US, France, Italy. So it's not what we think necessarily. Thank you. I'll share it with you and then maybe you can.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. Thank you very much. Any other brief comments from our participants?
Yeah. So everything depends on what you call ESG. So let's say in the US, you saw that even prior to the pandemic, we had a lot of social unrest and things like that. So the notion of social issues that have an impact, and there is more and more push regarding bringing accountability to firm. So in the media is extremely, it's more and more present, and people awareness, population awareness of it's there, and that is why there is a push, and that is why there is such a political interest toward it, is because in many countries, and I think the US is representative of some countries, you do have in the ground, in the population, a real interest and awareness. So yes, people are aware it matters.
Great. Thank you. Well, at this stage, I think I need to pass on the floor to Fabrizio Botti, the Senior Fellow at the Institute of International Relations in Rome. And Fabrizio will pretty much summarize our today's discussion. The floor is yours, Fabrizio.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yaroslav. Let me also express our gratitude to Valdai Discussion Club that co-promoted the event with us, with the Institute of International Affairs. Also the event cooperating partner, CARI, and all the panelists for their very, very valuable contribution. It's hard to try to wrap up all this multidimensional discussion and reflection we had today. Let me just say a few words. What are the roots of this event? The Institute of International Affairs promoted as scientific partner of the Italian presidency of the G20 and also T20 co-chair, this discussion considering the significant growth of sustainable finance and green investment in recent years. And this happened with different financial strategies based on sustainability metrics that the most widespread of these are based on ESG scores. So as discussed in the panel, the risk of the current lack of international coordination and transparency are several. These risks are several, and they have been explored and discussed extensively today, leaving all of the participants and the audience with inspiring insights on the challenges that are lying ahead and the possible way of addressing the needs of us, of people, planet, and prosperity, as in the Italian 3 pillars of the presidency. Mariano Machado and Claude Lopez provided two different perspectives and proposals for the G20 process coming from the T20 Italy on the ESG challenge. Mariano highlighted, as in his policy briefs, the G20 potential role in delivering a global public good, such as an internationally recognized standard for ESG investment, looking, and that it was really original and interesting, at the connection between ESGs and SDGs. Claude urged the G20 to take a proactive role in defining standardized metrics, disclosure, and also narratives in order to assist investors and companies and different actors' decisions. And using our words of today, what are we talking about? Mr. Matura of the Observer Research Foundation cover, among other inputs, 3 main points: the important role of multilateral institution leadership, including multilateral development banks, of international financing regulation for harmonization, and institutional investors. It was interesting the fact that we refer to shareholder voting on climate-related issue and importance on that. Mr. Pristanskov on Normica share with us the B20 perspective and an actual recommendation from the task force, from the related task force, on the issue of strengthening the foundations of international cooperation on ESG standards, with very interesting reflection. Let me catch a couple of points on SMEs constraints and potential role also, and the fact that it should be not follow a one-size-fits-all approach, given different legal framework, development level, etc. And this was an issue that that came out in also another under intervention, not a one-size-fits-all. The government representatives, Anton for the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, and Agostino Inguscio for the Italian G20 Sherpa office, offered very important reflection on these contributions and key recommendation from the perspective of policy making. This was very, very valuable for all of us involved with different engagement groups. Let me just remind you that the video recording on the event will be available soon at the Istituto Affari Internazionali website, IAI website. I really hope all of you enjoyed the webinar as we profoundly did. Thanks for your active participation, your kind attention, and I wish a wonderful day to all of you.